Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're a creator, podcaster, blogger, or someone who is trying to make money online, then one of the most effective ways to do that will be to have an email list you can write to and sell to. ConvertKit is the email marketing platform designed specifically with creators and online business owners in mind. Get your email marketing set up with ConvertKit by going to placesandprofiles.com/convert. The song Country Roads, most prominently sung by John Denver, is one of those songs that just seems to be everywhere. I've heard it all over the US, I've heard it internationally, and it's a song that seems to bring up certain emotions no matter when I hear it or where I am when I hear it. I was excited to have this conversation with Sarah Morris from West Virginia University to discuss the impact of the song both within West Virginia and globally. I enjoyed having this conversation about such an interesting song and such an important song, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Sarah Morris about the significance of the song Country Roads to the state of West Virginia and the global impact of country roads. Sarah is an assistant professor in the English department at West Virginia University, and she is West Virginia University's coordinator of undergraduate writing. She has extensively researched the impact of the song Country Roads, has an extensive background as a teacher, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Transformation, Translation, and Complication, Take Me Home, Country Roads. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/4. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate it. So I want to get started by looking at the background and the origins of the song Country Roads. Before we dive into what exactly this means globally or what this means for West Virginians, let's just get an overview of what this song is. It was sung by John Denver, came out in 1971, but given your research, what else can you tell us just about the origins and the background of how this song came about?
So I think the story has been pretty widely told by the other songwriters, Bill Danoff and Taffy Nivert, who collaborated with John Denver on the song, but they had a full version of the song pretty much that they had been performing around Washington, D.C. in 1970. And when they collaborated with Denver, he helped them with a bridge and altered and edited a verse. And then they performed it together on an evening in December 1970 at a bar. And there happened, interestingly, to be a group of West Virginians in the audience. And so they initiated a standing ovation at the end of the first performance with John Denver of Country Roads. And from there, the trio recorded the song, and it became a hit very quickly. It's sold 1 million copies within 6 months of its US release. It was number 2 on the Billboard charts. It was covered and released nationally and internationally by artists in many different genres within 5 years of its initial debut. So what we see is this hit that became as popular as it did, I think, because it had this wide-ranging appeal. That it's not, even though it mentions West Virginia, it's really not specific to West Virginia unless you have a West Virginia connection. And it's also interesting that the songwriters, all 3 of them, they have these kind of peripheral relationships to West Virginia. Taffy Nivert went to college across the river in Ohio, and so she spent some time in West Virginia's northern panhandle. Bill Danoff had never been to West Virginia, but living in DC, West Virginia is always kind of peripheral there. And John Denver did tour with his band, the Mitchell Trio, in the 60s, stopping at lots of different college towns. He was at West Virginia Wesleyan and Marshall, for example, and he performed at Concord College in 1970 before the collaboration with Danoff and Nivert. So there were these interesting kind of peripheral relationships from the songwriters to West Virginia, and also West Virginia was very significant and visible in national media at the time. So there's this widespread popularity that created this affectionate feeling toward a state even though the song doesn't really portray the state accurately.
Now, you mentioned that West Virginia was prominent and visible in national media at the time. In what ways? Take us back to the early 1970s. How was West Virginia so visible in the national media that that would play a role in this song, even if it's not really about West Virginia, mentioning West Virginia and leaving such an impact on West Virginians?
Well, in the 60s, in 1960, both presidential candidates, Kennedy and Humphrey, visited the state on the campaign trail, which was unusual. And then when Kennedy was elected, he appointed a presidential commission mostly made of West Virginians to make federal recommendations focusing on roads and roads building and infrastructure and economic gains to Appalachia. And then in the 60s, there was also the Appalachian Regional Commission, which focused on the war on poverty. And out of these initiatives, there was Medicaid and Medicare, Head Start, VISTA, a lot of which affected West Virginia. So West Virginia was kind of highly visible as a model for federal aid to Appalachia, and it continued to be in the spotlight nationally through the 1960s. So we've got those kind of 10 years leading up to the song. But also there was an environmental movement in the 60s and 70s that noticed the state's acid mine drainage issues, strip mining. So then there was the Clean Water Act, which affected West Virginia. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. So there was this national attention on the state in a couple of different ways, politically, in terms of economics and poverty, in terms of the environment. And living in Washington, D.C., these two songwriters would have had to have been blind to not notice that it was very much on the national radar.
Well, and some of those issues that you raised with poverty, with environmental efforts, these are still very much a part of West Virginia and the trajectory that the state is taking today. So I want to return to that in a moment, but let's take a step back, because I mentioned in the introduction that you've done extensive research into the song Country Roads, that you have this forthcoming book coming out. Now, you were mentioning to me in our pre-show discussion about your experience in West Virginia, your connections to West Virginia, and how you view West Virginia as home. But why did you decide to devote so much time, so much of your research to the song Country Roads? How did that decision come about to take your work and focus it in that direction?
So I think there are lots of reasons. I'm a West Virginia native. I grew up in West Virginia. And if you grow up in West Virginia, like even now, my students talk about this, but I grew up in the 70s in West Virginia, and Country Roads was everywhere. It's still everywhere. But like my dad had a music box that was a copper Model T Ford, and it had a crank on the side, and it played Country Roads. So the song was everywhere. There's this kind of universal experience that when you talk to West Virginians, especially folks like me who were kids in the 70s, when you went away on vacation, your parents would wake you up when you crossed the state line coming home, and you'd sing the song. So it was this artifact of identity that was always kind of present in my life. And when I started talking to students here at WVU, I started to realize that how present it is in their lives. And I was teaching English 101, which is, of course, our freshman composition course. And my students were really struggling with rhetorical analysis as a genre. And I thought, I really need a model song, or I really need a model text for them that I can use to teach them this skill that we can practice on together. And I was walking across campus to teach this class, and I'm thinking about rhetorical analysis. And in front of our student union, there was a preacher standing on a wall, and he had this sign that had a very divisive message. And I could tell that he was shouting his message, but I couldn't actually hear anything he was saying because there was this ring of students around him singing Country Roads. And I thought, oh, there's my text. That's my text that I need to use in class, because our students and West Virginians use it in so many different transformative ways to say lots of different things rhetorically. And from there, I started using it in my classroom. And then I started thinking about all of the different versions and variants and what it means to people in the state and outside the state. And I got really curious, and I went on a 4-year research journey where I talked to the songwriters, and I talked to West Virginia songwriters who write songs about West Virginia. And I learned about state history in a way that was new for me. And I learned about the other West Virginia state songs and how West Virginia has spent lots of money on tourism and economic development, and Country Roads is part of that. And so for me, it was really about getting curious about this artifact that was very, very powerful and all around me my entire life, that I never thought about as a piece of cultural rhetoric and as a marker of identity. So it's kind of the long version of how I came to this work.
Sure. Now, you mentioned earlier that the song Country Roads, although it mentions West Virginia repeatedly, that it's not really about West Virginia. But as we've already gotten to, even in the short time that we've been together so far, the song has played such a significant role in the state of West Virginia and in the identity of West Virginians and the attachment that West Virginians feel towards the state. So why is that? Because you just said there are other songs about West Virginia. There are other songs that are official state songs of West Virginia. So what is it about Country Roads that has been the song that West Virginians have really latched onto? And how has this song that was written by people not from West Virginia, who had West Virginia on the periphery, but hadn't really spent extensive time in West Virginia in some cases, how is that the song that is so associated with West Virginia today?
Yeah, well, and that's fascinating too, right? So when Country Roads was released in April of 1971, it was almost immediately clear that it spoke to people everywhere, right? It was there was this popularity that was driven by listener demand, and the song got really popular because people started requesting it on radio stations. But what radio stations in West Virginia and requests to radio stations in other states from displaced West Virginians were kind of instrumental to making the song a hit in the United States. Now, that's not to say it wasn't a hit in other places, because it was, not necessarily Denver's version at the time, which is also interesting. But I think there was this immediate popular appeal. So it was released internationally first, and there were service members who sent it home to radio DJs who started playing it in West Virginia as kind of like a bootleg tape, and it started spreading around the state. So that's really interesting. But also, West Virginians embraced the song immediately. So they were encouraged by media conversations, public and private performances. John Denver performed it on the Capitol steps in 1971. Almost immediately after it started to become popular. West Virginia newspapers published the lyrics so that people could learn them and sing along. WVU gained usage rights in 1972, so just about a year after the song's release, which is genius marketing. So I think that people took it up, and they took it up very quickly, because it was a portrayal, and it still is a portrayal of place that's largely positive in the face of very negative stereotypes about the place where we live.
And you mentioned that there were other versions besides the John Denver one, but that John Denver's version was the one that was embraced. And John Denver himself was very much embraced by West Virginians as well. What was it about his version that West Virginians really latched onto? And what did his connection to West Virginia become in the years after that song, before his tragic plane crash death in the 90s?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I do want to acknowledge that particular version of the song, right, the original version of the song, is Danoff, Nivert, and Denver. And Taffy Nivert and Bill Danoff performed with John Denver often. So an example, they recorded the song with him. There's an example, there was a 1985 flood here in West Virginia that devastated lots of the state. And all three of them came to Charleston, West Virginia, our capital, and performed on a telethon fundraiser. So the three of them together, I think, had some influence, more so than just Denver. Denver's version was the version that was released first in the United States and became very popular in the United States. And I think that he had this kind of country boy image that spoke to West Virginians. And also, there was a lot of publicity work that happened around the song in the United States, but also in West Virginia, like the opening of Mountaineer Field here at WVU. Our then governor brought all three of the musicians to sing at a football game. So I think because West Virginians embraced it so readily, they also kind of embraced this familial feeling for all three of the artists. And in fact, Taffy Nivert told me that she's been made an honorary West Virginian more than once, which is really interesting.
So what does the song say about home? The lyrics obviously make reference to this notion of a place where I belong. But what exactly does it say about home? Because, even though this, as we said earlier, the song mentions West Virginia, but it's not really about West Virginia. But because it talks about West Virginia, it brings that connection for West Virginians. What does it say about home, though? And how does that really drive home for West Virginians when they're listening or singing the song?
So one of the frameworks that I think about in my book and in the work that I've been doing is the concept of hiraeth, which is it's a Welsh term that means longing or nostalgia or grief, but really it's longing for something that you can't quite understand. It's like an existential longing for an imagined space. And I think that Country Roads really triggers that. It's a place that we want to belong to, or that doesn't really belong to us, or that never really existed in the first place. So it's this romantic, idealized version of home that I think everyone can relate to. But for West Virginians who are maybe so used to being talked about in terms that are less than positive, it's this artifact that we can hold up as a shield almost and say, here, this is how we can be seen, or this is what our home could be. And also it's a way of deflecting the criticism.
Well, I know that sense of home is one of the main reasons why the song has caught on outside of West Virginia and outside of the U.S. So I want to return to that a little more here in a moment. But you've mentioned multiple times that this song is something that West Virginians use to push back against some of the negative stereotypes about West Virginia. So for anyone who's listening, who's maybe not overly familiar with some of the issues at play in West Virginia, can you get into that a little more? What are some of these stereotypes, some of these stereotypes that maybe are based on some real problems, some of these stereotypes that are maybe exaggerated and are not based on real problems anymore? And the way that this song is used to counteract the problems that are perceived as being in West Virginia and some of these very real issues in some cases that are being faced by so many West Virginians.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think it's important, and I talk about this with students all the time. It's important to acknowledge, and Chimamanda Adichie says that the problem with stereotypes is that they are always incomplete, right? That they're distorted depictions. And while they might have an element of truth, they have historical patterns and cultural patterns that are related to power, right? So there are distorted depictions of West Virginia that are built on stereotypes that trace as far back as the colonial years. And I think some of those stereotypes resurfaced in the 1960s. It was a period of mass outmigration in West Virginia and Appalachia. And there was this kind of second discovery of Appalachia during that time that was prompted by social science and poverty advocates. And it was based on a deficit model, right? So looking at the place as an amalgamation of poverty and dysfunctional hillbillies who moved out of the hollows and into cities. And the thought in that time was, one, how to help people who were maybe not as representative of the entire region, and also to send them back where they came from. And I think that the song itself is a way to say, oh, well, here's a different kind of mirror. It's a different way of looking at Appalachia. It's a different way of looking at West Virginia that doesn't bring in some of the stereotypes.
Now, you mentioned outmigration, and unfortunately, there has been a decline over the last several decades in West Virginia's population. Charleston and Huntington, the two largest cities in the state, have seen their populations more or less cut in half since 1950, 1960. So while there are stereotypes at play with the way the outside world perceives West Virginia that maybe in some cases have a kernel of truth but are exaggerated and are not true, the outmigration and people leaving West Virginia, the numbers back that up as being a real phenomenon. What has been causing that outmigration? Why has that become something that has been, unfortunately, a constant in West Virginia for several decades now?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I will clarify that there are people who are better qualified to talk about the economics than I am. But I think we can trace the idea of things like absentee land ownership and investment that were codified legally even as far back as the 1700s, that speculator rights there was this system of absentee land ownership and economic growth that was going outside of the region instead of staying inside the region, right? So we can trace it all the way back. Some of our laws still favor non-resident landowners. Courts tend to be more sympathetic to large firms, outside corporations. That there have been issues with mineral rights. Industry it tends to be controlled by out-of-state interests, even as far back as the turn of the 20th century. So we have all of these economic factors where the people who live in West Virginia maybe don't have their interests represented or protected. So we can trace patterns of outmigration all the way back to 1930. That sustaining a family became increasingly difficult. Profits from inside the state went to individuals outside the state. So between 1930 and 1960, the economy shifted and mining practices started to change. Mill and production work started moving overseas. Technology started changing and jobs disappeared. So there was a little bump in population in the 70s and 80s. But since then, it's continued pretty much steadily. So even in the 90s, there was a high level of outmigration, and most recently, we've had a 3.2% loss in the state population from 2010 to 2020. That's about 60,000 people. We lost a congressional seat. We've lost 4 congressional seats since 1960. We once had 6 representatives. Now we have 2. So I think we lose representation and we lose visibility and we keep hemorrhaging population.
Well, and I bring up the topic of outmigration in part to explore that issue, but also to serve as a segue to start talking about the song Country Roads in the context of people who are not living in West Virginia. And in a moment, I do want to look at the impact that the song has had for people who have never lived in West Virginia, maybe have never been to West Virginia. But before we do that, what has this song meant to people who are West Virginians, grew up in West Virginia, they have family ties to West Virginia, but they've decided to exit the state? How has that song impacted those people, and how might it be perceived differently by people who have left West Virginia than people who have remained in West Virginia?
So, as part of my research, I did a survey where I asked people about specific moments associated with the song. And I was so moved and overwhelmed by the number of people who have left the state who would hear it at a county fair. One woman wrote to me and said that she was pregnant and she was homesick, and she heard it at a county fair in, I think she said, Idaho. And she just stood there and wept in front of the stage. I think it's this kind of swan song call to a home that doesn't exist, and yet we want very much to be a part of. And every West Virginian who has left the state, I think, has a story about hearing the song someplace and being moved. My parents experienced that in the 70s. They lived briefly in Utah, and they tell the story. They still tell the story. They're in their late 70s about being in a bar in Price, Utah, and the band playing Country Roads, and they both just sat there and cried. I think it's this familiar marker of what cannot exist, and yet the thing that speaks to the very core of what it means to be West Virginian at the same time. It's an interesting contradiction.
Sure. And, I've seen and heard this song as part of my own travels. I myself have been to West Virginia, but I have not spent a whole lot of time in the state. Hopefully that will change in the years ahead, and I'll get to spend a lot more time there. But 6 years ago, I spent some time in Southeast Asia, and I was in Singapore eating lunch on the Singapore River, and Country Roads comes on over the speaker system at the restaurant I was at. A few days later, I was in Malacca, Malaysia, and there was a street performer performing in the main square in Malacca, and he's singing "Take Me Home, Country Roads." About a week after that, or a couple of weeks after that, I was in northern Thailand doing a jungle trek, and it was myself, being from Houston, some people from Chicago, some people from upstate New York, and there were a couple of native Thai guides who spoke very broken English. And as we were entering the jungle, one of them said in his broken English, "Let's sing a song," and started singing Country Roads. So I've seen, this phenomenon myself traveling internationally. And last year, when the NFL had a game in Germany, there's this clip that's been, assuming you've seen this, that's been circulating online, where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Seattle Seahawks, I think, were playing in Munich. And there were 75,000 fans in the stands in Munich that were singing Country Roads at the top of their lungs during one of the commercial breaks. So even though the song names West Virginia, we've said, it's not really about West Virginia, and it's something that has really seen tremendous popularity, not just outside of West Virginia, but outside of the U.S. So can you speak a little more to this phenomenon of how the song has become such a staple in places that are extremely far from West Virginia?
Yeah, that's something that's fascinating to me too, because everyone I know has a story about being someplace and hearing Country Roads unexpectedly. I have traveled myself and heard it, and I heard it in a bar in Thailand. There was a cover band that played it, and you're sitting there feeling like, whoa, this is so surreal. Or I was a part of a teacher group that went to Japan to study schools there some time ago, and visited a middle school in Tokyo, and the middle school marching band came marching out to welcome us and played Country Roads. And I sat on the stage and cried. I mean, I think that people hear it all over the world, and people have told me about hearing it all over the world. And I think part of that is because there is this resonance, right? Like this sense of home and what it means, that sense of Harayaf, that sense of existential longing for place. And it's true in a specific way for West Virginians, but the song also has this generality that it speaks to anybody who's longing for home. Right. So there's that, but there's also marketing. And if we look at all of the different cover versions in RCA really wanted to hit all the markets. And so they immediately started distributing the song once they realized how much of a hit was to other markets. So Ray Charles recovered a version in 1972, and it was sent to African American markets and international markets, right? So then we could trace that version through like the Toots and the Maytals version or Israel Kamikawiwo'ole's version, right? Both of which talk about places other than West Virginia, right? The Toots and the Maytals version is Almost Heaven, West Jamaica. Israel Kamikawiwo'ole's version is West Makaha, right? It's about Hawaii. So I think we see that, right? That marketing. In Asia, Olivia Newton-John's version, which was in 1973, was sixth on the Japanese charts at the time of its release. And Denver's version too was very popular in Asia. It was played a lot on armed forces radio in regions with US occupation and army presence. So I think that we saw this widespread distribution very early on, intentionally marketed. That said, there are all kinds of versions that don't name West Virginia at all, that are in other languages, that just have the tune, that maybe don't preserve any of the original words, which is fascinating too. So I think there's something about the music itself that taps into us. And I'm not a musicologist, but I think there's something about music that's primal, about chord work that's primal, that speaks to some deep thing inside us. And then when we combine it with this universal feeling of homesickness and longing for home, it makes the song really, really powerful.
One of the best ways to make money online is via email marketing. Even with the prevalence of social media use, building an email list and writing interesting, informative, and entertaining emails as part of a strategy to sell to the people on your list is still possibly the best and most effective way to make sales and increase your revenue. I use ConvertKit for my email list with the Places and Profiles podcast, and I highly recommend it. ConvertKit is a tremendous platform with a great reputation and is designed specifically for creators, bloggers, podcasters, and online business owners. ConvertKit has tremendous functionality and is very intuitive and easy to use. Get your email marketing set up today for your blog, podcast, or online business by going to placesandprofiles.com/convert. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/convert. So it's this combination of chord work and the notes of the music along with the lyrics that generates this sense of longing and nostalgia and homesickness. Is that what you would attribute to the global popularity of the song and all of these different cover versions where they're swapping in and out some of the words to identify with their own homes?
Yes, I think so. Plus marketing.
Okay.
Because we can't deny the power of a global music industry.
Right. Absolutely. So, moving forward, as we're sitting here in 2023 and West Virginia, obviously, as we said, this phenomenon of losing seats in Congress, population decline, some of these issues that maybe have transformed into stereotypes, unfortunately, but have kernels of truth to them. Many of these issues are very much there, and something that we haven't gotten into a whole lot here, but the energy industry and changes in energy, where so many jobs in West Virginia have been connected to coal, and that's become a controversial topic nationally as coal is maybe viewed differently and perceived differently than it once was, and there's a push for green energy jobs. So as these changes are occurring on a national scale, on a global scale, and within West Virginia, what can the song say to West Virginians moving forward, and how can this song continue to be such a positive, counterbalancing force for West Virginia as continued and new challenges and issues are faced by so many people living in that state?
Mm-hmm. So I can't speak much to the coal industry and economic fortunes, but I think one opportunity that West Virginia is taking up is how the song is being used to promote things like tourism. it wasn't an official state song until 2014, and the rights weren't purchased for use in tourist materials until 2017. And now it's part of our literature and drawing people to the state. We have a new national park, our New River Gorge National Park. So I think, and if you go around the state, there's this campaign where our tourist board has created these swings, like these Instagrammable settings in state parks where you can sit on the swing and there's an almost heaven script behind you. And I think that there's a real opportunity to leverage the song, not just as a mirror that reflects something different in the face of stereotypes, but as a lens for looking at what West Virginia does have to offer, and a way for thinking about this very rich in people resources, very rich in natural resources, very beautiful place. Yeah, I mean, I think that these are themes, right? That can shape West Virginian identity even now, but that can call people home to a place they've never been that really is West Virginia.
Well, and I know we're getting a little off topic here, but since you mentioned tourist efforts in West Virginia and the connection to country roads there, for people who have never been to West Virginia or who haven't spent much time in West Virginia, can you speak for a moment about some of the natural beauty and some of these tourist opportunities that you see popping up across your state?
Mm-hmm. So anyone who is into the outdoors would find a lot of very rich opportunities here. There's climbing, there's hiking, there's rafting and kayaking. We have all kinds of natural spaces, but we also have fantastic music scenes, and we have really great homegrown foodways and lots of culture. We have museums and art, and it's a really great place to be. And I think we're much more complex than the stereotypes suggest. And I think everyone should visit us, and people should also come and stay.
I'm looking forward to spending more time there in the years ahead, as I mentioned earlier. But one final question before we start to wrap up. We've both shared experiences of places where we've heard the song Country Roads outside of West Virginia. I mentioned my experiences in Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand, and you mentioned experiences in Thailand, in Japan, your parents' experiences in Utah. But how about in the state of West Virginia and for West Virginians? Yes, it's used for tourist purposes, but the prevalence of the song within the state seems to be extremely large. It's associated with college sports, West Virginia University sporting events, and well beyond that. So can you speak for a moment to just how prevalent the song is within the state of West Virginia, and some of the places that we may not have mentioned, some of the ways that we may not have mentioned, where this song is a presence in the lives of West Virginians on a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. I was actually just talking about this with my class yesterday. It's a sophomore level writing class, and we were talking about all the places that they hear country roads. And it's really ever present at WVU because it's part of the official WVU insignia. So if you're standing on campus at noon, you might hear it in the bell tower carillon, right? Like it's around us all the time. It's on people's clothing. But West Virginians play country roads at weddings, and they play it at funerals, and they play it in bars. And when you hear it in the state, sometimes a hush falls over the room, or everybody sings. One of my favorite things to do is to go into a bar and play it on the jukebox and see how people respond. And that kind of universal sense of being home in a place that maybe doesn't always feel like home, with a song that names home, but imperfectly, can be really beautiful.
All right. So before we conclude our conversation for today, if someone who's been listening to this wants to learn more about your work or wants to learn more about Country Roads, what resources would you direct them to? Where would you recommend that they go?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I would say is that Bill Danoff has told so many stories about Country Roads so beautifully that I would recommend that people look up Bill Danoff and see what he has to say about the song. There are live performances online, and I think that he's a really great living resource that can tell us something that I can't. So that's first. And then second, I'm hoping to have this book come out in a year or so is the hope. So for my book, the working title right now is Transformation, Translation, and Complication, Take Me Home, Country Roads. And it's currently under review.
And can you take a couple minutes to talk a little bit more about your research and this forthcoming book, what someone will expect to find when the book comes out, and a little more about exactly what you've been doing to research Country Roads, its connection with West Virginia, with this notion of home, and with the rest of the world?
Mm-hmm. So the book itself really thinks about Country Roads as a kind of identity rhetoric. In West Virginia and in Appalachia, it talks about how it's this kind of reminder of identity and place, but it also talks about the power of the song to take people home to a place where they haven't been, right? That it's this West Virginia is this kind of country music every place in the song. There's a whole chapter on marketing Country Roads and how it's used in consumer imagery, how it's used in resistance, how it's used in politics, how it's used in campaign trail. So that's interesting. How it's used in context and out of context to represent West Virginia. There are portions of the book that talk about songs that actually are about West Virginia, and that may be worth a listen in contrast with Country Roads. And then the last part of the book is really about pedagogical implications, right? How songs like this are a kind of teaching tool that we can use to think about pedagogies of place and identity for young writers, but also for learners in classrooms all over.
All right. And I know I've said we're going to wrap up here a couple of times, but since you mentioned the use of the song in politics, and for better or for worse, probably more for worse, being a bit of a political junkie myself, can you speak to that for a couple of minutes before we do conclude this episode? How is the song Country Roads used in political campaigns?
Well, if you're looking at a political campaign within the states, it's always used, right? It's used at parties and fundraisers, but we probably don't have time to go deeply into it. But the 2016 Trump campaign used coal imagery and Country Roads in really interesting ways, and there are some great videos of political speeches where Country Roads is used and the crowd almost takes over the candidate singing. So yeah, it's persuasive to us, even for candidates who don't know very much about us.
All right. Well, I guess that will just give us some food for thought and a reason to continue this conversation again after the book comes out, and we can dive into that topic in greater detail at that time. Do you have an anticipated release date? I know you said that it's kind of been held up in the review process, but when should someone expect to be able to purchase and read your book?
So my hope is that it will move through review fairly quickly from now. It's been there for a little while, and within the next year or so would be the hope to move it through press to publication.
All right. Well, the guest today has been Sarah Morris from West Virginia University. Her forthcoming book, as we mentioned earlier, Transformation, Translation, and Complication, Take Me Home, Country Roads. That's the working title. So, of course, once that's available, there will be a link added to the show notes page. We'll have other resources, video links, other information related to this episode and related to Country Roads there as well. So the show notes page for this episode is placesandprofiles.com/4. Placesandprofiles.com/4. That's the place to go. And as I said, hopefully, once your book comes out, you'll come back on the podcast and we'll be able to explore this topic again, and maybe through a few different angles, a few different lenses, based on what you write in your book and based on whatever developments may occur between now and then. But in the meantime, thank you, Sarah, again so much for your time and for joining me today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.